So there's a lot of different topics to think about. And so this is just kind of casually talking about it. I might end up, if I get into a flow of topics, then maybe I'll kind of get the scripture out and speak more scripturally about it. References or some of my notes that I started on, but I just haven't been able to get to it. So getting to the topic of atonement, and I've been listening to various viewpoints, and so there's the Christus Victor, penal substitution, a variety of other views. And man, there's just a lot to think about in terms of this. What's kind of interesting, though, is I do think people are looking at scripture and they're trying to, trying to align things properly with the character of God and the ramifications as to what people believe. And I kind of think, so maybe I'll just kind of start on the surface. I kind of think that, so some of those that are more of the Christus Victor crowd, since I've followed some of them in the past, and I generally like the direction that they take, and I like the people that they become, the type of people that I've been around, take for instance like Greg Boyd, the type of people that I've been around that are in support, if I remember correctly. So I'm kind of just speaking casually. I could be getting some details wrong, so just take that into consideration. But the Christus Victor crowd, like those among Greg Boyd, I've followed their ministry for a long time, and I was attracted to their ministry at a time when I was worn out by colonial type frameworks of Christianity and whatnot. And I stumbled upon Greg Boyd's work several years back after 9/11, the country started to go through a lot of turmoil. And there was a lot of racism surfacing and anti-Islam sentiment, and it just seemed to solidify a type of nationalism, right? And it seemed to also reveal and portray a lot of ignorance as to quote unquote the other, right? And so I feel like a lot of people from my generation, probably just people across the board around that time that were old enough to formulate an opinion about their religious views, started to feel like they couldn't settle into Christianity. So this was probably around my early 20s. I'm 44 now. And people started to really question. There was this huge movement of people around my age at the time that were, they started to call it the emerging church, or the Great Emergence. You can also Google and find videos of different groups that were fracturing and there's even a book, I think Kester Bruin and various ones. So this was kind of more global, the modern global society of Christian believers, or those that had some kind of connection to Christianity. Because for me, I grew up with Christianity, but also my native tradition and whatnot. And so I'm familiar with the language of Christianity and the tension, the cultural tension, and the difficulty to fully resolve it. And then in some other tribal regions, I'm, also familiar with Catholicism and stuff like that. There's a whole history of different tribal regions being familiarized to different denominations. But anyway, that's a whole other side story. So I had grown up with that influence, but then I had gone through a stage where in my adulthood, even though I had good experiences and there was things I wanted to keep in relation to it, and I had experienced what people make reference to, like that, the spiritual experience accompanying it and whatnot, interpretation wise, I went through this major stage that a lot of other people were going through, And it just seemed like it had ripple effects. I didn't really know how far reaching it was in terms of other countries because, I come from reservation life. And so for me, it was like there was reservation life, then off reservation life. And that was enough to try to negotiate on its own. But then when I started expanding out of that, then realizing this network, in the social media era, we started to realize this is like a global movement. So anyway, around that time, there was a lot of people that were branching out, and they couldn't really find like a home base. There was a lot of tension and a lot of animosity growing within churches. And there were people that were really kind of solidifying certain views, and then some that were questioning those views, and just the whole range in between. So if you kind of look at older videos, you'll see that, take for example, there was this movement that Rob Bell had. Rob Bell was a younger pastor at the time, and he got a lot of flack for it. Like some of the Christians were saying his movement was demonic and da-da-da-da-da. And they had great concerns about what they're calling the Great Emergence. So I do feel like over all these years, people have changed. It's been a long time. People evolve and change. But initially, there was this tension between groups, say like Mark Driscoll and Rob Bell. You'll see videos where Mark Driscoll, a Christian pastor, well-known at the time when they even had like mega churches, did a video having this concern about this movement happening. So basically what you'll find is there was a lot of fracturing. There was a lot of movements going in different directions. And it was a time when Christianity was being challenged in a way. So this was like 20 some years ago, right? And you would find some people, it ruffled their feathers way too much. And so they were saying it was demonic and all of this stuff, right? Anyway, around that time, I remember thinking like, a lot of movements were developing in me. A lot of things were developing in me all over the place. I was also developing this like, certain connection because you're a young adult, and I'm formulating my identity and, my outlook on life. And there's a lot of things surfacing between, protecting our land and our people and our communities, and also this thing that's growing globally. And anyway, so I was at a time where I would hear a lot of the arguing going back and forth politically, right? The divisiveness. If people know my story from a long time ago, I have this really long story where I started to have this stuff happening in my life. This discomfort, this like quickening and this like unsettling of my life. It's like a whole long story to where it's developed up until this day. A lot of stuff had happened, even relocation, moving, just so many different things. I went on a whole journey of things. But anyway, before I even knew what it was at all, I just started having this like, just unearthing my life, really. But anyway, when I was in between things at that time, and I was feeling it, you could just kind of feel it in our country. This stuff was happening, this hostility, this like kind of like unearthing these racial dimensions of things that were, people had always felt was there under the surface, but it was coming out, right? It was like manifesting itself. And I even remember at a time, I started to have these like little seeds of things bubbling up in me. In retrospect, I was realizing, it was developing me into this journey and da-da-da-da-da. But I specifically remembered one time, this was probably, let's see, it was years later after we had moved back, and we were staying in this rental house. Let's see, it was probably about, 20 years ago. 20, yeah, because the social media thing happened about like 15, 16 years ago or something like that. And it was before, anyway, so I was working out in the yard, and I had this, like, I guess what you would call, like, kind of like a vision. I don't really want to get on a whole side story, but I was kind of like doing yard work, gardening, I guess you would say. And I was trying to clear out this space, or I was I was cleaning up. I was kind of doing some decorative work, and I had previously had these like desert stones and some plants, and I was trying to make this like kind of landscape scene. And there was a place where I was like readjusting stuff, and then I ended up kind of pulling out some of the little weeds and stuff, and then I ended up lifting up a section, and it just surprised me. So I lifted up this ground cloth, and I could see under there this whole network of stuff under the ground cloth, because you kind of imagine when there's ground cloth, you think it's just preventing things from growing underneath. But actually what I was finding is like, there's still a lot of stuff underneath. It just smushes it down. Like some stuff still grows, but it's like this grass and other stuff that just grows and it's smushed down, and then you just see the top. So I remember just kind of like pulling it up a little bit. And so this was like a few years into me realizing like, oh, I think I kind of have a spiritual thing happening in my life. I fought against it for a long time. It's like a whole long story. But this was some years into it where I was like kind of open to it. I was kind of like receptive and noticing it enough. And I was trying to like weave it into my life, a little bit into my life, kind of acknowledge it, because there'd been a lot of things happening where I knew I couldn't totally ignore it. I couldn't put it out of my mind and my heart. It would surface and wake me up in the middle. Like if I didn't kind of acknowledge it, it would like, I'd wake up in the middle of the night. I'd have all of these things. It was just like, really a factor of my life. So I started at that point in my life, learning to like kind of acknowledge it, weave it into my life, give it some kind of like acknowledgement. But then I'd have this other life where I would just live my regular life and do other things. And so for the longest time, I tried to balance those two different worlds. But anyway, so this was around that time where I was kind of like, acknowledging it a little bit, but still trying to have this other part of me where I was pretending like this wasn't happening. And so then I would start to get these little like bubbled up feelings. Sometimes I would just have this feeling, and then I'd have to like go write something, or I'd have this feeling and then I'd have to like go look up something or go somewhere or talk to somebody, stuff like that. It took me a while to kind of, anyway, blah, blah, blah. I don't want to get on a side story. So anyway, I'm just recalling as I'm talking about this. So I was in this mode where I'm like kind of acknowledging it. I'm kind of aware there's little hints of things. I'm noticing shifts happening. I'm noticing there's this divide and like almost like this palpable tension happening in our country. And around that time, that season in my life, I was able to be home taking care of the one child at the time. And so there were times during the day when I would be working or prepping in the kitchen and I'd listen to the radio. And it was around that time where there was just so much contention on the radio, and it would just start to really frustrate me. I'd start to feel like I would hear these political sides. And so it really started to remind me like, who do I think God is? Where is God in this? So that was kind of my mindset at the time, right? And there's this historical unresolved tension that had never really been resolved. So that was kind of my mindset. So I'm outside working and I'm not even thinking about that stuff at all. Not even it's just not on the radar at the moment. So I'm having a nice time, just kind of enjoying a beautiful day and doing the gardening stuff and the landscaping. So yeah, then I pull back that ground cloth when I'm adjusting some of the stones and rocks and moving things around. And then I see this whole network of growth underneath. And so just out of curiosity, I'm like, whoa. So I like lift it up more and I'm looking and it's like a whole network. And then I get this like flat, like kind of like, I wouldn't really say flash like a visual, but kind of like inside my mind, not like a physical flash, like I'd seen something like I'm having some episode or anything, but just like you, any kind of awareness where if somebody says some idea or you're reading a story or a book, then you kind of get somewhat of imagery in your mind. So just like that, but it happened really quickly. And I have this kind of like this bubbling up of like, and it's like this awareness of like, something to the effect of like, this is like America. And it kind of stuns me in a moment. And I remember pausing, like, because it was just such a different I don't know, it just kind of stopped me in my tracks for a second because it was just so clear. And then the imagery, and I remember seeing like imagery of like, this is like America, and then like kind of seeing this American flag. And so then as I paused and I went into it, and I remember kind of like internally responding to it, like, how so? And it was this idea of like if I were to put words to it, it was like God, or in my spirit, kind of saying like I've allowed America become established to some degree, like this top layer, where, you know, people have developed. I'm adding to it, like I'm trying to remember what it's like, but the basic idea was like, because today I'm probably adding to it because it's after the fact, after this it went into all these studies of like the system and theory and stuff that I later went on this long journey to develop. At the time though, so I'll try to keep it as simple as it was at the time. At the time it was something like the top portion is how America has started to become developed. But what's also there, what the reality is like all of this under the surface, this whole network under the surface that is still there, that is still also a part of what is a part of America. And it's coming to a time where I'm going to pull that back, where I'm going to basically pull the ground cloth back. And all of these things are going to come up. And I, like, that was it. It was pretty simple at the time. And so when you have those types of experiences, you could say your mind just conjured that up because that was already what was happening. Could be. It could be that my mind conjured up something that already was the sign of the times. It was already what I was feeling. It was kind of strange, though. I mean, there could be a way where another side of your mind puts together stuff and like drops it in the center square of the forefront of your mind. Could be. But what was also interesting about it was it started to formulate. So when something like that happens, you start thinking about it. For one, it stopped me in my tracks. I just remember like, whoa, what was that? And so then I was, like thinking about it, and I was like, that does make sense. What a strong imagery. And so I think for me, because I was having these experiences, I just almost expected other people to, like people I would assume would be open to these ideas and talking about them, to start feeling like feeling what I was saying when I would try to share things. And for the longest time, I just wasn't really finding people that were having that stirring. And then I started to wonder, like, am I like making this up, or why am I not finding any place for this? Because what started to happen is I would start thinking about that, and I would start realizing that there were things happening, right? Okay, so I'm getting off on this whole long story. Let me like rush through it. So I had multiple things happen. There's other stories to tell. It's been, like I said, like it started my senior year in school. It wasn't as strong my senior year, but I'm sure people back then could attest that it seemed like I was going through something like my senior year. And it wasn't even just this. There was multiple things. It was a whole intersection of things. It was still a pretty good year, but I do, in retrospect, remember going through a lot of just like things happening, and I was trying to like straighten out my life and be a part of the community and whatnot and do these things. But then I also was like being challenged in how I'd interpret things and whatnot. Anyway, blah, blah, blah. So that was like 26 years ago. And it's been a long journey, right? And it kind of got my attention through a lot of dreams and a lot of other things and whatnot. And it eventually developed into, through a lot of interactions, what I was calling systems theory, what I call systems theory. I mean, maybe there's some better thing to call it, but that's just what I eventually ended up calling it. What I was getting to in sharing that story, though, was at the time I didn't know where to find connection. There was this rift that was growing between various ones that I guess that you would maybe label them like Christian nationalists and then these like emergent movements. But the emergent movements, the great emergence or what have you, had a lot of different people in their groups as well that were different camps and wouldn't all agree either. There was just a shift in a movement happening. Anyway, long story short, that's where around that time, and I forget even how it happened. It could be that, so I spent a lot of time during that season of my life doing a lot of reading. So I can't remember the full sequence of it. Maybe if I spent some time refreshing my memory, I could recall. But somewhere down the line, I stumbled upon Greg Boyd's books. I can't remember if I stumbled upon him online on a sermon or if I first found his book, but it kind of makes sense that I first found his book because I remember reading one. So I went through a stage of just reading so much, so many things. And I stumbled upon his book, I think, titled Letters of a Skeptic or Letters to a Skeptic or something like that, where it's him having a conversation with his father that didn't believe in God. This was years ago. I don't know if I'd still believe along those same lines and stuff, but it was useful for me at the time. And I just remember I liked his approach. Greg's a very kind, compassionate person. So anyway, somehow or another, I started following him online. And it just was a good fit for that season in my life. Greg Boyd responded. He has a church, Woodland Hills Church. He had podcasts and videos and whatnot. And I just remember listening to a lot of his videos. And so I think what really caught my attention at the time was he was speaking out against like the war. Well, not really just the war. He was speaking out against like improper nationalism. And he wrote a book called what is it called now? Something Christian Nation. Let me think. Can't recall what it is. I'm surprised I can't recall. Oh, letter, or no, not that one. That's Greg. I'm looking at my books here. It's actually Sam Harris that wrote Letter to a Christian Nation. But that's even what I'm saying is like, there was this growing movement where, it was also around that time when Sam Harris started to come out and talk about critiquing, religion and whatnot too. And he wrote Letter to a Christian Nation. Trying to find the one that was Greg Boyd's. It's something called, Myth of a Christian Nation. The Myth of a Christian Nation. And I remember reading his book, Myth of a Christian Nation, and then Myth of a something about religion. Anyway, I read a bunch of Greg Boyd's books. I really did struggle with, so here's what I'm getting to. These groups with penal substitution and Christus Victor are also like people that preach from their churches a lot differently. They represent different groups of like the population. And what I'm also getting to is I'm trying to explain why I was attracted to Greg Boyd's side of the equation. And so I'm trying to get there. And then I'm trying to get to like areas where maybe I disagreed or, areas where I could see certain sides represented in different ways. So that's what I'm getting to. So around that time, in the context of where the churches were going, I was attracted to Greg Boyd's message because he spoke into the concerns that I had with the country and Christianity, and he talked about a religiosity and freedom from religiosity, and freedom from thinking that Christ is limited to these like land battles, these these forces and whatnot. And so it really was something that it was palpable to me at a time when there was a lot of hostility in Christianity. It was hard for me to even settle it in my spirit to even like, at that time, things were so potent. It was hard to say you were a Christian, hard to see God in things because people were just acting very racist and whatnot. And I would see the history of Native people through some of the lens of how people were treating Muslims and various groups and whatnot, and like the ideas of Islam. And it just seemed like a similar type of religiosity being unleashed. And so it was interesting that, like, that's kind of how I saw it, was like, some of these like ancient histories were going to be unleashed, and it would kind of almost like have that, unresolved, like, hauntedness of our lands, like, rise up. And in retrospect, it feels like I was being prepared ahead of that to be a part of a different alternative route, blaze a different trail, if you will. It was hard for me because it put a lot of pressure on my life, and I didn't know what was happening, and I was just trying to lean on other leadership, and it kind of put me in a position where I had to like settle it in myself that I'm not disrespecting various ones or this or that, the other. I'm differentiating, and I had to start having the language of like, I have to do this thing, like, that's what it seemed like to me. People can disagree, and I'm sure they will. But I'm just saying, like, some of the experience. And so it was that time when Greg Boyd and his church and various ones started just having a different approach to it. There was a time where Greg Boyd was so concerned with the misuse and what he would seem to say, like, the idolatry of the American flag. I'm not, like, I understand, like, and I think what he meant was putting it on par with God. There was a type of like United States worship, like false worship, that he seemed to be calling out, because at the time it was encouraging a trajectory in a certain type of approach to things. And so if you'll recall, at that time, he from his pulpit called out various ones for that, and he lost like 1,000 people from his church or something, or people walked out or something to that effect. But it was his conviction, and he would say like it was their church's conviction to like stand with the oppressed and etc., like kind of speak truth to like his, like what were his convictions. So I do know that there are some groups that disagree with him because of some of these approaches, even though at the time he would even tell them, like, this isn't like a left or right thing. He wasn't agreeing with, at the time, like a lot of like, he was saying he wasn't necessarily like a Democrat. He wasn't there was this whole rift happening, right? Where anybody that would be Democrat, liberal, they would categorize as that, right? There was, these divides going on, and he was basically saying like, no, I'm conservative. Like, I generally vote conservative. I try to have a practical approach to money. He has these sermons, I think, where he talks about, I forget the name of it. There's just so much in the archive of his sermons where he addresses that, and he says, I generally tend to believe in like Christian, like conservative values and etc. But I'm calling out some of these other attachments to it. But even so, even if that's what he said, they still, in the polarization, like, were against him. And so there was this huge rift happening. And anyway, what I became influenced by in some of the approach that he takes is he generally tends to have this certain standard that through the image and the practice of Christ, we get the revelation of what God is like. And so a lot of his standard in how he approaches things is that through Christ and through Jesus, we finally get this revelation as to the truth of what God is actually like. That God isn't violent, that God isn't this warmonger, that God is love and sacrifice and all of these things, right? And then he takes that and retroactively interprets through the scripture, where do we find love in this? Where do we find the option for redemption? So that's probably influenced me a lot more than I always know. And so this is also how he would argue his point for not being nationalistic in that same type of way, not being a warmonger, but he talks a lot about love and laying down, that sacrificial love for redemption of others and whatnot. And so there's a lot of things that I could draw from it, because in practice, he's a very loving person. He seeks to have that commitment and that committed love for other people, and that committed love to healing in communities and historical wounds and whatnot. He shows very much in his actions that he speaks against like racism and these types of like occupying forces and things like that, I guess you would say. And there are some areas though where I still would maybe think differently, but there's enough where he's just like he's a good human being, right? And so they're like, I could see sharing society with people like that, where it's like maybe there's some theological disagreements, but it's not enough to like tip the scales or create some holy war or anything like that. And so generally speaking, I maybe agree with like 70 or 80%, maybe even more. I don't know. I haven't followed his stuff for a really long time. It's probably been 12 years since I followed his stuff. There was just a season in my life in my 20s when he kind of carried me through those like I depended a lot on like his teachings online, and I listened to a lot of Rob Bell and various ones. So just so people know, like I'm influenced by them, but also because they were very much showing themselves to be practicing a type of spiritual mutuality. Anyway, I can see though how some people, so it kind of makes me wonder at times, like something I noticed that people struggled with in his approach is that he's also anti-violence, non-violence, like a pacifist. He's a pacifist, and he tends to believe that like God is a pacifist and absolutely like non-violent for the most part, generally. And he also carries that through to like other certain practices of just like pure nonviolence, right? Which for the most part is generally pretty good. I agree with a lot of that, and in practice that leads him into being just a pretty good human being. And so I appreciate that. But where this comes back to these other questions, how do we square this idea with like, so some, I feel like some theologians that have issue with him, even if they're not categorized as like extremist nationalists or warmongers or things like that, I think some people, even though they appreciate him as a human being, where they struggle with it and where they struggle with some of these versions of Jesus and what Jesus is and how they interpret scripture is they use that lens of the absolute love of God and the revelation of God and nonviolence, non-warmongering, the end of the warrior God, things like that, which there's good things in that. There really are there's like truth that you can see in some aspects of scripture. These are really smart guys, like, so they're not just pulling that out of nowhere. There are aspects that you see that in scripture. Whereas there's this other side of it though, where I noticed, because I engaged in, for a brief period of time, they had like online discussion boards and stuff, and I participated in them. I think they put a pause on it because, social media just became difficult. It was difficult. It was a little bit too challenging for various ones that just needed like some of us, like for me, I'm a deep thinker. I like to be like, sometimes I like the challenge, as long as like people are trading ideas and not using them as an excuse to keep other horrific acts in place. If like, I enjoy the trade of ideas when like we're not trying to simply just negotiate to stop people from killing other people, if that makes sense. Like for instance, like now I don't always enjoy the discussions online because sometimes it feels like a distraction where I feel like priority is that people are like, stop torturing people. But there's times where I feel like they're using the excuse to distract and argue these points so that they can keep these other things, these trajectories in place. And that's where it frustrates me, where it's not enjoyable. It's like horrific kind of. And I just feel like people would wake up and prioritize things on those manners. But generally speaking, when it's not an emergency state like that, and we have some room to negotiate ideas, I generally like that. I generally like to look through and see like what's the truth there, right? You can kind of tell the difference though between people that are using excuses and deflecting so that like they just have animosity. It's not like a curiousness or a flexibility in their spirit. But anyway, so there are times when it would just become like even more contentious and whatnot. And so I think they took a pause on those. I'm not sure. But I know like I haven't been involved for a long time because my life also went in these other directions. But anyway, people though had concern with him where they liked him and they liked his message and he was a good person and whatnot. But they did struggle with the pacifist side of things. They struggled with pacifism. They struggled with other portions of the scripture. They felt like it didn't quite line up with things. And so that was true. Like they were still trying to lead a good life. They didn't see themselves as like extreme nationalist warmongers and whatnot, or racists and what have you. But they legitimately didn't know how to really look at the idea of pacifism and nonviolence and is there ever a vengeful God and what about the other parts of the scripture and stuff like that. And so then that's where you kind of get these other conversations that come up where I do think there's different camps. There's different degrees of it. There are some people that they just seem like they just want to anchor on the interpretations in scripture of like conquering lands, a default into like not thinking clearly, no critical thinking, no examination. They just want to default into this trajectory of hostility. And they seem to like justify things in scripture for this one-sided hostility. And demonizing other groups. But that's like the extreme, right? Then there's other groups that they're on a different degree. They see the aspect and they accept the aspect of this loving God. But they also feel like it doesn't tell the whole story, that there is this other side of the pain and atonement and suffering and things along those lines. And it's not as though Greg and them discredit those. They do talk about suffering. They do talk about entering into your disciplines and the suffering of it and the sacrifice of it that you take on in yourself through love and things like that. But a major one was like the pacifism, even to the point where people had disagreements in some of these emerging movements, which this is where I find myself in some disagreement as well, is that they would take on the nonviolence pacifism approach so far that they would even be against eating meat and stuff like that. But then some would say, but we don't push that on other people. That's our choice, which so I see that. Like I can see that. And there's all these different degrees, like I said, but it still did leave me with these other feelings. So this is where I can validate and acknowledge the other sides of some degrees of this conversation, where some people are thinking there's something more going on there that we're not accounting for, though. It's not just just love and life and like nonviolence. There's some aspect of something that needs to be accounted for there. Like we're not quite getting it. So I think that's where some people go into the language. They revisit the language of what they call penal substitution, in the sense like, and I'm not an expert in terms of like the official interpretations of these certain categories. I am familiar with the text. So like if someone says this portion of the text, because I've read through and studied the text, but I'm not always familiar with every denomination's different like doctrine or official language that they reference. But anyway, I'll just kind of talk in terms of what some of what I know about it. And so like this idea of penal substitution is that there's a penalty for sin and that somebody has to atone for that sin. Like there needs to be, like somebody needs to account for it or pay for it, or there needs to be somebody to pay for it. And so other people will disagree with that. They'll just say, God, that's horrific. Like that's child abuse. Like if the father is trying to make his son suffer, like you've probably heard all of the different ways that people interpret it. Like, like that's, like what father would, instead of granting forgiveness, just want you to suffer, blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera. But then other people will try to unpack that and they'll think, what's going on there? What's going on with the idea of like a penalty for sin? Like there must be legally, in terms of justice, like a penalty for sin. And so then it goes deep into some that might agree that there is a side of God that's vengeful. There is a side of God that is so just that he has, like, there has to be a penalty for something. One of the things that I recall Greg Boyd talking about a lot, as he kind of tends to be on the other side of some of these conversations, right, is he interprets the stage of Jesus as like God's rescue mission, as things kind of got off track and it wasn't God's ideal to, like create these difficulties and then use it as a way to like force us into compliance, but that he interprets the story as a type of rescue mission, often trying to account for how do we see love in this situation. And so then other people are trying, because it also says in scripture, like the law is summed up in love. And so he generally is interpreting these factors as like things we don't understand, they're acts of love. But then when some people are trying to argue the points for other positions, they're trying to also argue that point as well. Like, how is this love? And so you'll hear different theologians kind of make reference to these ideas of like penal substitution with, well, if God is love, then there's justice, and then there's payment for injustice, and things along those lines. And then you'll hear a lot of people say, well, but it's still, in those interpretations of the story don't seem to make sense, because it's not justice to make somebody else pay for someone else's sin. That doesn't seem like justice. Where you'll get, like different people really trying to adequately argue the points and saying, well, that's why God sent someone to take that penalty in place of us, because we deserve it, because we're so sinful and we deserve it. And then other people will say, this doesn't seem to make sense either, because how are you categorizing people in sin as all deserving of some kind of punishment, like on par with like a murderer, and then just some child born into this world that you're saying born into sin? And so people just say, it just doesn't seem to make sense, right? And so I guess the question is along some of these lines, like what I'm starting, going into this topic is, what do I believe? What is it actually saying there? What seems to like coincide with both the story? What is the story actually saying? And then how do we apply that to, does this make sense? Is this really a redemptive message? Does it stand the test of time and that kind of thing? I'm starting to like, the direction I'm starting to shape the way I'm reading some of it is, so you'll have to be reminded that I feel like in my systems theory, or whatever you want to call it, maybe there's another name for it that other people say, oh, that sounds like this idea or that idea or such and such. How I started to formulate a lot of the ways that I would use as a tool or a lens to apply to scripture is what I started to see within what I call like the systems theory is this inescapable aspect of the unit aspect. There's like a unit component inescapable in types of creation. This probably eventually will go into what people talk about, like, is there Trinity or is it talking about something else? Why does it seem like there's some type of, what I'm saying, unit aspect in this that is inescapable from it? When I'm trying this on and I'm thinking about this, and as I was saying, I still want to listen to some of the other arguments and still through this lens of like what I'm thinking about. But I'm not looking at it really as isolated cases. Most of the language that we use in this, like what develops into a reparative mission, or as like Greg Boyd says, like a rescue mission, or other people might say like a redemptive narrative or things like that, is that eventually it's never escapes some kind of social dynamic. It enters into, take for instance, like Paul the Apostle says, I think it's Paul, says something to the effect of like, without the law, there would be no, I forget the exact wording, but like no sin or something to that effect. Like the law introduced helps to reveal the sin. There's a lot of theory, interpretive work to do there because it kind of is a confusing passage when he's talking about that. But it brings me up to the question of the law, right? And this idea of when the law is introduced, it's a social code. It doesn't really come into play, or it's not enacted or generated unless there's like two or more people. It's like a social aspect of something. And so you find that it becomes apparent and it starts to reveal the split that we exist in. And so this is why I say, like, I start to examine scripture through this, what becomes this like a lens of looking through this inescapable unit existence component. And this like imposing upon us of like a system force, a unit force. And that simply just seems to be an attribute of our existence, how we're existing, how we experience life, what another portion of our life is. Like there's different degrees of what seems to be our personal selves, our collective selves, this unit force, etc., etc. And then eventually into like developed into systems, right? Kingdoms, systems, dominions, what have you. And so as I'm thinking about that, to me, it doesn't really make sense to interpret the stage of sin as personal. I know people might think that, okay, it sounds like you're saying, though, that there's collective guilt. And so I know eventually, way down the line, people have issues with what they call collective guilt. I mean, I do think eventually there's a sense of doing your personal work, not being a part of certain dominions where you can kind of differentiate between that. But anyway, for now, I just wanted to say, so people don't just mentally turn off and say, are you saying collective guilt? It sounds like you're saying collective guilt. But let's just like pause on that because we're not to that point yet. We're just talking about within existence, there's inescapable unit factor and whatnot. It might be more accurate to say like collective susceptibility. So we're born into like collective susceptibility. So I guess what I'm introducing is this idea. I don't know if like I'm introducing it, but that's kind of how I'm interpreting some of it is when it talks about sin, it starts I think it's referring to that we're all born into collective susceptibility. We're born into dominions of sin, like factors of susceptibility to these dominions. And so there seems to be this other factor that is like an attribute of whether we find out it's some kind of dimension or whatever we say about existence, is there's an aspect of something about the way we exist in our perception, our dimension, or what have you, that when there's something input into the network, it affects us. It affects the whole unit, the whole dimension that we're in. Even if we're not directly of that dominion, when it's there, we basically all live downriver from it. And so it's almost as though it affects the whole dimension to where the radar is stifled, or what's a better like explanation or comparison to make, like an imagery or illustration. It's like almost like a radar or something that is like obstructing everything across the board. So even if, say, you live on this side of the world or some effect, it affects you. We all live downriver in this dimension of things. And so at some level, it seems to like have like a web of an effect, even if we don't always like palpably understand that level. I mean, some will say, no, we all are fully sinful at the same manner. or, or what have you. But I just don't want to get into the arguing on that point. I'll just try to introduce what I'm talking about and then maybe creating a defense later on. And so it seems to be more as that, like we're born into this susceptibility. And then as we grow up, we learn the sense of that limitation, and we learn how it affects us, how we all live downriver from it, how we can't really escape it. We can't go around it. We have to go through it and transform it to some degree. And there's different layers of susceptibility, right? And anyway, so that's kind of what I was saying, is like born into susceptibility, and we're born into certain types of where a dominion has affected the whole life experience, the whole web of experience. And so we're not always like at the same degree of susceptibility. There could be some sense where people are trying to live more neutral lives, but they're still not always actively transforming. Like, so there's somewhere in the network where it's manifesting or things are occurring. And so I think it kind of reads more, it makes a little bit more sense for me to think of it that way, because then when you look at scripture and you look and you see the way that it maps out dominions and degrees of the world kingdom, it really starts to make sense to you, at least for me, when I started studying it through dominions, kingdoms, systems, and susceptibility. This is where, when I look at it through so I guess my suggestion would be to people, or explaining what I'm going to be thinking about when I'm reviewing their arguing points. Maybe I shouldn't say arguing points, but because some groups will say there's an overlap here. It's not either or. They're simply just trying to defend for things in the scripture that don't seem accounted for. And where there are certain attributes of this, that, and the other. And so what I'm proposing is try on the idea, or this is what I'm going to be trying on when I'm reviewing these arguments, is how can this be maybe remedied if you read it through a lens of dominion and not just like personal. The language of personal does come up later when the dominion is put in check, and then it frees people to make a choice individually to start remedying their life and shaping it toward this other dominion. And then that's where we get the effect of like a personal transition, where you're refining yourself unto this other like freed, liberated system, but you're still susceptible to this world and accepting that it has these certain degrees of like unresolved effects of the dominion, of the corrupted dominion. And it's being slowly deconstructed and whatnot. And to me, that helps me to make sense to some of these like situations and whatnot. Because if you look at some of the effects where it appears that God is speaking the language of the world animosity, for me, it's always as though I'm imagining. So like when I'm trying on this idea of the dominions, the kingdoms, the systems theory, it's as though you're seeing God speaking through like the pure language of God that doesn't encompass those attributes. When God intersects with the world that does reign through those attributes, it interprets that way. It's experienced through that language. Some people might say, well, anyway, I'll just leave it at that. We can have people argue their points and whatnot. Like I said, like in Ezekiel, it does make reference to that, like speaking through the idols. It could also be, some will say, well, a just God couldn't do that. You're just saying that it's appearing, like he's either saying it and it's not registering to us. We're not experiencing it that way. But isn't that how life is, though? Like, aren't there things where it's not, like you're not living the full revelation of God, and so you're living in a space that is like a, maybe if you're working on your like spiritual life, you're breaking through that pervasiveness, and you're hearing more and more and more and refining more clearly in what the actual true revelation of God is. Does that mean God was lying to you, or does that mean there was a limiting factor there? Anyway, I won't overcomplicate it for right now. I'll just leave it at that. Almost argue or suppose, maybe I wouldn't argue it at this point. I'm supposing that the level of sin is never really fully in the image or on the imagery of how we're created. That the level of sin is always the put on dominion. And so the level of sin, when you're looking at sin, is always a part of this put on dominion. And so the language of transitioning it always goes through that dominion. And so what we find in scripture is we see the kingdom and we see the dominion and the parts and the pieces, and it speaks through those stages. And so speaking and mapping out through those stages and helping us to understand the kingdom force, the mapping out of it, helps us to understand how we dismantle it from our lives and continue to be refined and see more clearly. And so I guess when you're thinking about, so you're kind of, it's like you're imagining there's this heavenly dominion, expansive, and we're created in this imagery to be able to keep evolving along those lines and grow ourselves. But then there's this kind of encapsulating, a obstructing dominion that's manufactured from the skewed, corrupted aspect of development. And it's pervasive, and so it causes people to see through that lens of things, right? And it's also deceptive, where people also just eventually don't know how to discern between the worlds, the levels of dimension of existence. And so one aspect of the redemptive narrative is also just to reveal the way out to the utmost of, to the full gamut of mapping out what it is to break out of that, the steps that someone would enact or replicate to break out of that dominion. And so I do see one aspect of this message, creating likenesses to help us understand, to acclimate to what that transition is, and then to see it enacted to break out of it, to be free from that dominion. And so through the storylines and the symbolism, that's what you see occur until we're just free of that dominion. So within comparing those two occurrences happening, you find language where eventually there's parameters placed around that whole dominion, and the law is set within it to almost implode it. And so this is why, or set it into eroding it, taking the power from it. And so it seems like that's why Paul even uses that language of the system of death, and the law has been placed within it, and so the law is under the curse. The law has been built into the curse to deconstruct it, to erode it, and it points toward the opening to be relieved out from it, to this new dominion. And so that's kind of generally a basic way to look at it. So along these lines, if you're looking at this type of dominion, if you're looking at it in term, along those lines, then you can kind of see, so there's this intersection between putting in check this dominion that's fading, and then pointing toward this more free kingdom and whatnot. And so so in a sense, it's kind of saying there is truth to saying the attributes of God are beyond this. The attributes of God are this all-loving, non-violent, no aspect of death, no aspect of death drive, that kind of thing. And so that's where you could say portions of the story are these attributes of outside, beyond this dominion, this world dominion. And then at the same time, but as we are stuck in this dominion, this corrupted dominion, you know how it says in scripture, something to the effect of taking what the enemy meant for bad and using it for good. Then there does seem to be this other stage where the very mechanism of corrupting the world and corrupting existence through this dominion force, which is claimed as error, wrong, corrupted, whatnot. then in and of itself, because of that corruptedness, and then because of this like mapping it out and then producing this breakthrough, allows for us then, by turning it around, to use it against itself and to take steps to de-escalate it, to deconstruct it. And so in a sense, even though in the ultimate grand scheme of the dominion of God, we don't have a spiritual right, I guess you would say, to enact certain things, but in the corrupted version, as it's already set its own standard of corruption, it therefore then, in a sense, kind of gives us the right to walk it back in a just manner, to deconstruct it. And so it's through the corrupted system that it provides for us the ability to not create more evil, but to respond to that which is corrupted and evil in a just manner, to speak unto it what is incorrect, to speak unto it the truth of what it portrays, but recognizing that comes from the corrupt dominion. That's not something that is justifying yourself in the dominion of God. And so what that therefore then requires people to do is to stay in par with what progresses stages of justice, what is true as it increases toward God, but not like produces evil, if that makes sense. Because of that, then there's this warfare and this battle of information, and this warfare and battle of technicalities and entrapment and all of these other things. But even in and of that self, so what you then find is, what people are really seeking also is understanding truth, understanding what the truth is, understanding the mapping out of the path that one can take toward progress. And so what we get in the message of Jesus then is the full mapping out of what it looks like to confront the system to its ultimate power, to its ultimate end. And so when you get the story of like the crucifixion and whatnot, that's not an image of what God needs. That's an image exposing the full mapping of what the dominion does. It's exposing what it does. Because if you think about it, so there was this one, so I was taking some quick notes when I was listening to Atonement Theory, and I still, like I said, I still want to listen to some of it. But I'm just trying not to like keep putting it off. And so I'm just trying to talk myself through some ideas here, and I have already started rambling. It's like an hour in. But one of their ideas, though, that they had brought up was there is an aspect of there needing to be justice, to call into account, to lay out the degrees of the actual suffering. And so this is where I think there is some legitimacy to those stages, where you're taking a proper criteria onto how horrific, how corrupt some things are. Like an honest mapping of it, an honest mapping of the degrees and dimensions of it, how it got to that point, what led up to it, what the ramifications are of it, what the torment and terror and all of the things are, right? Because okay, so then there's a lot of things. It just kind of reminded me of something else, but I'll try not to get off track. So they had mentioned that try this idea on, like if the crucifixion was simply just in the spiritual realm, a technicality of justice, like I'll suffer their penalty for you, and then like the contract is void, and then everything's good, right? They're kind of like saying this notion of there wouldn't really be the redemptive value if there wasn't the prolonged suffering, like how treacherous the sentencing and the display and the portrayal of it was. And so they were trying to say, like, so imagine if there was just this technicality, like they took him behind closed doors and he suffered the penalty. Would it still have had the effect? And so you kind of are confronted with this imagery. I mean, I'm adding to what they're saying. They said it in different ways, but it seemed like they were kind of getting to this point that there's something about the full display, the revelatory display of it, the testimony, the public display, so that there's a testimony, right? There's an experiential confrontation. And there does seem to be some truth to that. Like it wasn't just in the spiritual realm of some technicality of some penalty. And so what I seem to gather there is an aspect of what seemed to be happening is the prolonged aspect of it isn't because God needed it to be this prolonged, agonizing sentencing to appeal to God because God needed justice in this like outright display of suffering. I don't think it reads like, I just don't think that portrays like God's character, but I could see though the other reasoning of what people are saying. There was like something about this display though, this excessive display was part of the transformative value. So I think that's some of the question. And so there does seem to be something there, but then what's going on there? If it's not attributed to like God's characteristics and desire and need, where is it coming from then? What is the necessity for this prolonged suffering? And so immediately when I heard that through the lens of me listening to the systems theory, this dominions that I'm talking about, I'm thinking of different categories, different hierarchies, different layers and stages of the dominion. And so what I'm envisioning there is it's the prolonged aspect, what's actually happening there, what requires for that to happen, and that it's different levels of complexity of the dominion. Different enactments, different hierarchies, different authorities, like the authority of this group, that group, and that group. And so it's all of that intersecting that makes this prolonged. All of the complexities and the social web of things that's making it prolonged. And so another part of the redemptive value of it being such an exposing display of horrificness being on display for everyone, that portion being the transformative value is that it brings to the full level what the system does. Because there was also such a veil of functional maintenance and managing of the system that usually would happen behind closed doors, right? And so there was this functional maintenance of this, almost like this membrane, this invisible membrane of functional society and system. And it never really fully confronted to where it was like outing itself as to what it really does on the full gamut of what it is, what it does. And so on some level, the redemptive value for the disciples to have that testimony of being fully confronted with, this is what world power is. World power is this. I think that is the display that was needed to sear into the minds of the public. This is like we're running the full course of it from the whole system all the way onto like where the system kills people. The system sets in motion the parameters that stifle life, even to the point of their law code. And so that's one portion where I think the redemptive value, where people needed to see it and experience it and have it exposed before them, is propping up the imagery of the full mapping. Not that God needed it to be like that, but that groups to have the full testimony and full confrontation of it so that they know the magnitude of what happens, what the system does, what its power is exposed in the light. Then you see the mechanisms of what it does. And I think that was the prolonged aspect of it. That was taking you through every stage of being outed, of the degrees, right, of it, of the system, and of its mechanisms of power, of its mechanisms of the law and whatnot. Go into this other stage. There's a lot of different topics that go into this whole discussion. But another one that is difficult to think about is how people will say the atonement theory just doesn't seem to make sense though, because it even says in scripture, like in Numbers and various, probably in other places too, I can't recall right off the top of my head. And so it makes reference to that nobody can actually atone for blood spilt than the one that actually spilt it. Like you can't substitute for somebody else. And so that's part of what it states in the Bible. So then how do you use substitutionary theory? Something that you could think about is this notion, if somebody couldn't truly substitute, there was something else going on. So something that's also interesting to think about is where in scripture it says, if death entered through one man, through Adam, then life could enter through one man, which was through Christ. And so in that sense, it's not even talking about the atonement as much as that if death can enter, then life can enter through one man. If death can enter and affect all of existence through a dominion, then life can enter and turn it around, or, affect the whole existence through life, right? And so, when you're thinking about it on those terms, you're like, okay, that's true. Like so what's the effect of this dominion? So one of the aspects, like the attributes of the dominion, the corrupted dominion, is that it's a system of death. There's certain aspects unto death, right? And then it becomes these certain types of appeasing for death, attempting to appease for death, thinking that God needs this type of appeasement, misinterpreting the attributes of God, all of this deception and misunderstanding, et cetera, et cetera. And then one of the effects of it is not so much just misunderstanding what God needs, because ultimately it's revealed God doesn't need that. That was like a deception. That was a misunderstanding. False attributing to God, trying to appease God with what God didn't need nor want. But then the question is, well, then where did that sense come from, though? What was also animating that sense? And some of it seems to be that the ground seemed haunted. The ground seemed haunted and like unresolved. So there was this like confusing animation where people would think, oh, God must need, like I'm oversimplifying, God must need us to have this appeasement or these other things. And so just compile and never really appease it, right? So then there's this aspect of, okay, God could just enter, so one of the effects, the attributes, is death entering the system, right? But the animation of improper death, like spilt blood on the ground, things like that, injustices of death, then cause haunting to the land. And then people would manage that haunting, or certain effects of unresolved haunting of the land, haunted blood accounts and stuff like that. Then they would feel like there's no appeasement for it. They would attempt appeasement for it, and there wouldn't seem to be an appeasement for it. And so then it's also interesting because part of this like equation or what have you is that, going back to that, like nobody can really atone for the blood except for the one that has spilt the blood. But then what even goes farther than that is there's never really an atonement for that in that sense, like along that pattern of death, because something is lost that cannot get back, right? Even if someone pays for it, somebody unjustly kills somebody, and then someone goes and suffers some consequence for it, it still doesn't remedy it. It doesn't fix it. It's not really like repaired, even if somebody like suffers a penalty for it or what have you. But that still is a step toward, possibly trying to like balance the scales, right? But it still doesn't quite like remedy or appease it. It does kind of seem like one of the effects of all of this stuff going on is to pull back from improper attempts to appease it, improper claims, improper demands, improper ideas about God, and to start setting up a template to acclimate to better ways of processing through things, and at least pulling back the excesses of felt expectation to attempt to get closer and closer to a way that society could manage the blood accounts, even if they're not always like fully able to like remedy it. Could say, if you're looking at the story and if we're not always looking at what we actually believe in existence to be true, but just looking at the story, or it could be, right? Like this is what we're trying to consider, is like, what do we believe? But there is that sense of like, well, if you actually pull out death from the equation, then it could possibly remedy the blood accounts, because then there's this aspect of redemptive life, which seems to be part of the equation, is that there does seem to be in the story a claim for like a redemption of life. And it seems like that's what people were like banking on, was like, oh, there's these claims of like, we can resolve all of this by this life restored. But then it didn't seem like fully consistent. It seemed to be a statement of faith, but then it wasn't fully understood. We were still trapped in this dominion. So there does seem to be some sense of like something awaiting beyond this dominion, something out there, maybe in the heavens or some experience. So that's where some people get that experience of there's something beyond this, like existence points towards something outside of this. So then there is this sense of people saying there's a conquering of death and they're in the heavenly dominion. So then that's where you kind of get that idea. And that we're not there yet because we haven't de-escalated this system yet. Like we need to commit to like deconstructing the corrupted system and entering into like that full freedom, that aspect of connection. And though, what do we do with the language though of like atonement and whatnot? To be some kind of transition there having to do with fulfilling the stage of the law as it was time to fulfill it for the transition of dominions and world dominions. And so it does seem to be that the law was kind of like a holding place for managing atonement and helping people seek ways to better repair or manage things going on. And so the stage of Jesus was continuing to like using some of that imagery and that practice to enter into it, to free it even more so, to become the place of that practice. So then instead of going to the temple to utilize this imagery of lessening and managing these things, then you look toward Jesus then as this kind of like the imagery of fulfilling the temple, as helping to map out and manage those stages of what we bring toward God as we're working through like remedying things on the world stage and whatnot. But what he does seem to do is like become that bridge between the kingdom of heaven and this worldly kingdom through the law. So he utilizes the law to create that bridge, that type of like breakthrough, utilizing like fulfilling the stage of atonement. And so he does seem to lay claim to the stage of atonement through that mechanism that allows the kind of like the vault of collected hauntedness of death and whatnot to at least be like pointed toward and opened up the floodgates toward the heavenly kingdom, so that over time God can remedy that claim from the corrupted world dominion that it had from the vault of death, to like remedy that claim as it sets in motion toward heaven, but having not fully yet like atoned it all, but created the bridge of atonement, I guess you would say. And so at some level, the language of atonement is so that he's justified in fulfilling the stage of the law's atonement, holding space. So maybe it's not as much saying that it's all yet finalized, but it's set in motion to be finalized in terms of it being ushered into like the heavenly kingdom, at least if you're looking at some of the story and whatnot, as Jesus fulfilled breaking the dominion of death into the dominion of life. Anyway, I said a lot there. I said I wasn't going to like unpack everything. I feel like, so this is getting long. I'm just going to leave it at that. And I do feel like I've introduced some of the ideas that I was thinking about. I'll just leave it at that and then review other people's opinions and whatnot.